Great. Thank you so much for joining us. What a great start to the day. I jotted down, I guess we would call this an instant tweet. I guess before there was Twitter, we just called this a quote. The one that I wrote down from that first session is, I want to be a CEO that serves 7 billion people. I like that. Now, from the earliest days of shared value, we know that the concept has generated a global dialogue. A global dialogue, something you'll see in this room over the next few days as you meet people, we draw people from around the world. And early on, when we started thinking about the initiative, we realized that as our own organization, we needed to think about how to seed and advance that global dialogue that moved somewhere past just logging frequent flyer mileage. And we wanted to find out ways that we could empower the people working around the world to advance shared value in the different political and economic systems in which they work around the world. It's not all the same. And we started supporting this global dialogue about 3 years ago, generating a global community of practice by launching our affiliate network. This network is made up of firms from around the world. We have, at this point, about 30 firms that operate in 50 different countries. These firms work across different types of professional services and work in every corner of the globe, from Korea to Colombia to all parts of Latin America and Australia. As I mentioned, we think about these, I mentioned this morning, I wanted to talk over the next couple of days of sources of inspiration in this community, and our affiliates are one source of inspiration. And more than just inspiration, these affiliates are creating new knowledge and practice that is advancing shared value around the world. Even in this event over the next couple of days, I want to point out that these organizations, four of these organizations, so Matter Unlimited, Innate Motion, Cohesion Strategies, and the Terrace, have been working in partnership with FSG and the Shared Value Initiative to develop new thinking on how to link the creation of shared value to the creation of brand value. How do you connect how shared value leads to enhanced and increased brand value? A relevant question for many of the companies in the room. And in addition, in the lab sessions, you'll see affiliates like Pixar Global, Compartamos con Colombia, and Alula, who will also be contributing to these sessions. Now, in this session here, we get to focus at a slightly different level, and I'm pleased to welcome the four gentlemen to my right. We've also had two organizations emerge in the last year. In fact, we had conversations with Peter Yates at this event last year to talk about building organizations that could advance regional and country level shared value dialogue and thinking to advance knowledge and practice in the places in the world that they work. And we have a moment here to focus on these conversations. So let me introduce our newest regional affiliates. We have Mr. Peter Yates from the Shared Value Project in Australia, the chairman. Mr. Robert Johanson, who is with the Bendigo and Adelaide Bank, a community bank in Australia. We have Mr. Amit Kapoor, who has founded the Shared Value Initiative India, which is actually being formally launched and announced here at this event, as well as Mr. Wilfried Aulbur, who's joining him to talk about the progress that we see in shared value in the context of India. So without further ado, Peter, let me hand it over to you to have a dialogue with Robert.
Well, good morning, everybody. I was asked to first of all share a little bit about the Shared Value Project in Australia and then take the opportunity to interview Robert Johanson, who is, as Justin said, is the chairman of the Bendigo Bank, one of Australia's leading banks, and a bank that's got an extraordinarily long-term interest in the shared value concept. So how did the Shared Value Project emerge and what it is? We are effectively the regional partner of the Shared Value Initiative. We're a member-based organisation. We have the benefit of the membership of a number of large Australian corporations, also consulting firms and not-for-profits. Those fees fund a small secretariat, and that small secretariat effectively is the distributing agent for the concept of shared value in Australia. How it actually emerged, and I think it's important to note that to get an idea out, you have to have both a channel pull and a channel push strategy to really drive an idea. And the affiliate network was actually really pushing the idea hard into corporations. But to get channel pull, obviously lots of Australian corporations can't spend the time or the money or the jet lag hours to come here to New York to hear the story. And so what we've effectively done is, by creating an overarching network in Australia, we've created the channel, the channel push that we're able to drive in Australia. So we have the dialogue with the analysts and explain shared value analysts. So when the analysts interview the CEOs of Australian corporations, they've already got an idea about what shared value is, and so that's who we are. And we've been around for about a year. Helen Steele is our Executive Director, Rod Ellis-Jones is our Deputy Director, and we're really delighted about the progress that we've been able to make, and we're really very passionate collectively about the concept of shared value. So that's the background to the Shared Value Project in Australia, and now I'm going to have an interview with Robert Johanson as one of the great captains of industry and drivers of shared value. I also have a particular privilege because when I was a young 25-year-old coming back from Japan to Australia to get a job, and the only thing I could do was to do Lotus 1, 2, 3 on a WAN computer, I applied for a job, and Robert actually interviewed me and gave me the job in 1985. So this is quite a funny moment for both of us. Robert, Bendigo Bank, you're a leader in the community as a banking and a financial services organisation. Your community bank concept, which is such a wonderful example of shared value. Tell us about it. How did it emerge? What were the challenges?
Thanks, Peter. So in about now nearly 20 years ago, we'd just become a bank, and we were but we've been a building society since the 1850s. The organisation was founded on the goldfields of Bendigo when groups of miners, after a few years of living in tents, got sick of it and pooled their resources to build houses for each other. So effectively they pooled their resources, they took it in turns to get a house. So that was the first building society. And once they all got a house, it folded. But then someone thought this was a good idea, so the organisation was set up on a permanent basis. So the insight that the entity emerged out of a community need from people who were, in a sense, cut out or disenfranchised from what was then the banking system. That was where this thing, what's now Bendigo Bank, came from. 20 years ago, we were a bank. It was a crowded field, lots of new entrants in banking in Australia. We were a very small player. But as banking consolidated, a lot of branches in country towns were closing, were being shut down, sensible rationalisation. But those towns were suffering because without a bank, without the plumbing of finance in a community, communities can wither. So in one particular, in fact, two towns in country Victoria, towns that were on any basis probably too small to sustain branch banking, what we did was enter into a partnership with those communities. So the communities got their money together and bought a franchise. They own the branch, they employ the staff, they decide what hours it's open, and they take an interest in what banking gets done in it. We provide all the back office, the training, the IT, the capital, the risk management, and we share the revenue. Now that town, that first town, currently that community bank, and that branch cost them about $500,000 to get up and get going. That branch now contributes each year about $200,000, which that group puts back into the community. So over that 15 years, millions of dollars has been poured back into that town and built social infrastructure. It's contributed to childcare facilities. It's contributed to a lot of social infrastructure. And it's of no surprise to you that about 95% of the people in that town bank with the community bank. If we just turned up and opened a branch, we would not have had anything like that penetration. We wouldn't have had a business as robust and strong as that business is now for us. So this is very good business for us. It's business we would otherwise not have got. And the town is prospering too, because the value of the banking that they would do anyway, but which would be unrecognised and dispersed, they've collected and concentrated. We now have nearly 350 similar towns and local communities that own their local branch distribution business. It's business we otherwise would not have got. And it's a kind of business that in 2008, when the world of banking was blowing up, when from most small, apparently vulnerable-looking deposit-taking organisations, money was fleeing, we didn't suffer that. In fact, we were a beneficiary at the time when funds were leaving what were perceived to be other weaker, small organisations. Why? Because people trusted us. They trusted us because they'd seen, through this example and now many other examples, how we worked together, how they could rely on us, and the value that they could get out of it. So it's been terrific business for us. We now find ourselves the 5th biggest retail bank in Australia. All the others who were in the queue ahead of us have gone for one reason or other. And I've no doubt one most important reason is we have high levels of customer advocacy, we have very high levels of staff engagement, and we have very high levels of trust. And so in a world of banking where those attributes are generally not found pretty commonly, and people, now as a result of the experience, are very critical, contemptuous of banks. And yet we find ourselves in that privileged position.
Robert, the analyst community. Right now, Bendigo Bank is extremely successful, great days again for everybody. Wouldn't it be cheaper for you just to go and buy out your community banks at a low PR and just trade it up onto the stock exchange? Isn't that what the analysts want you to do?
Well, if they may, and some do. But if we did that, we know that we would be sabotaging, in a sense, the very basis for what it is that's made us distinctive. We would be sabotaging the strategy. It is the difference. Now, a lot of it's not a strategy that can't be replicated. But this is not an overnight strategy. But it could be destroyed overnight. It is, like all good strategies, fragile. And particularly because good long-term strategies do rely on things like trust. It is fragile. And sure, but if someone invests in our bank, and they do it on the basis that we will give it up because we'll try and make quick sales regardless of their impact, then they should be. It's like we'd say with our customers. If we get a customer just because of price, we know we'll lose them because of price. We know we have to be competitive. We won't write home loans more expensive than other people write home loans. Our customers aren't mugs. They'll go to where they're competitive. But if we can offer the same price, then we've got a good chance they'll choose us because they see the value that we create for them in their communities. We have this saying, successful customers make successful communities, and successful communities create successful banks. but it's in that order.
And finally, Robert, the shared value concept, how is it evolving in Australia? What stage is it at, do you think?
Well, I think the pressure on all commercial and other participants to actually be seen to be doing something for the community rather than simply for a sectional interest. So feeding off prosperity rather than feeding into creating prosperity. That pressure is persistent. But in other ways, the consequences of those pressures, where that leads to bad behaviours or short-term behaviours, people now have the weaponry to actually hold you to account better. I mean, Twitter is a marvelous discipline on bad behaviour, I think. So I think the pressure on companies and others is huge and growing. And I think the awareness that you can't just manage a business for the very short term, you do need to continue to nurture prosperity. That's our job. Then I think that's becoming more apparent. But do I think that the strategy we're talking about will become so common quickly that in fact it won't be a strategy anymore because everyone will do it? I think it'll last a while longer.
I think sounds like Helen Steele's got a job as the Executive Director of the Shared Value Project for a while then. Well, thank you very much indeed, Robert. I think we're going to hand over to...
Great. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Robert. I love this notion of aligning the business's success with community success, right? The community is successful and the business is successful. Amit, it's hard to sum up in 10 minutes what's going on in a country like India with 1 billion people with shared value. So you've got a tall order in front of you, but please introduce the Shared Value Initiative India, the work you're doing, and then we'll hear from Wilfried.
Thank you, Justin. If you really look at the Shared Value Initiative in India, it's actually driven by a very important aspect, that the social objectives and economic objectives are going to go hand in hand in the future. If you really have to solve the problem of 1.3 billion people who reside there, we have to fundamentally look at the business models. We have to fundamentally relook at the way capitalism is actually being talked about. So looking at this whole idea, we are really pushing forward with the Shared Value Initiative in India, wherein we would be looking at 3 or 4 distinct things. The most important one is going to be research and publication, trying to push the agenda forward. The second is going to be a congregation of sorts of people, wherein we are able to bring people together to discuss the practice of shared value. Of course, it's going to be a membership-driven body, but fundamentally the question is going to be, how do we really push the agenda forward in India? How do we really talk about models which go beyond CSR? And in fact, we already do something very interesting called the Porter Prize on Creating Shared Value. The question is going to be, how do we really take the next steps in terms of saying that there is a shared value enterprise, a certification that can actually be given to enterprises who imbibe this whole practice. And of course, the shared value index that we are really looking at working with the stock exchange in India to really, because we are fundamentally sure, or I'm convinced that when you look at the future, enterprises who imbibe shared value as a construct are going to be actually beating the stock markets without a doubt, because that's where you actually look at what we can fundamentally call as social objectives and economic objectives. So having said this, I would really like to move forward with Wilfried. So Wilfried, what do you think? What is going to be India's role in the global shared value context? Because India is going to be one of the hotbeds of experimentation in terms of the new capitalism.
Yeah, I think if you look at India in general, what you see as a country that is unique. It is the largest democracy with huge discrepancies. Somebody made a comment that the US poor are the envy of the world. That statement clearly doesn't hold in India. It is a country that has had some phenomenal success also. If we look at post-independence, the country was able to stick together. We have 30+ nations in India that were molded into one cohesive political unit. If you compare that with the EU, we're still trying to convince the Brits that the Channel is de facto narrower than the North Atlantic, right? And if you ask the Germans, they think the Greeks are actually living on a different planet, right? So I think what we have to see in India is both the challenge and also some very, very significant successes. That in itself will drive alternative solutions. There's one example is the Delivering Change Foundation. The Delivering Change Foundation runs the project management office for the Chief Minister of Maharashtra. This guy is Fadnavis. He is the blue-eyed boy of Prime Minister Modi. So he needs to prove that he's actually delivering change. What they do is they track initiatives in his office, and at the same time they leverage an NGO with 75,000 women in Maharashtra, 1 woman per poll booth. So they get bottom-up feedback on a live basis, telling the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister, listen, your water initiative is working, you have an issue with infrastructure implementation. And these are concepts that are now being exported as well. We have an application of this concept in Mexico, and there's a discussion with Merkel in Germany to see how does this kind of model actually make sense even in the environment of Germany or other European nations. So I think that's basically the opportunity in India. We can drive innovation, new business models, and new approaches to solving problems due to the pressures that the country faces.
So, Wilfried, coming back to the Indian context, what do you think would be the idea of replicability and scalability of models? Because in India, you just cannot have one enterprise solve the problems. You have to really look at replicability and scalability as well.
Yeah, I think we discussed it already this morning. The key issue in India is profit, right? Profit is not something that is bad, but it's really an enabling factor to drive change in the country. A good example is HUL, Hindustan Unilever. They started with their Shakti Amma project as a CSR activity. So they basically said, we'll take some money, we'll give it to some ladies in the villages, they start selling our products, and we really don't care. If they sell, they don't sell, doesn't make a difference. That didn't work. They didn't get the talent to look at this channel, they didn't get the determination to drive it, so then they changed it into a shared value initiative and said, okay, fine, we will measure this with the same KPIs that we have for every other channel. We will enable those women via very cheap mobile phones and a particular application that allows us to order and track stock. And with that, the model basically scaled to about 170,000 women. These women make about $70 to $100 a month, which in a village means they are lower middle class. And these were women that had nothing before. And the profitability of that channel is as good as the normal profitability of any other channel. Driven by innovation, they're actually leveraging cross-selling opportunities to drive profitability of this channel. But I think that is a fundamental thing for India that's even recognized by Prime Minister Modi. Because the way he changed Gujarat is by actually not giving water and electricity for free to the farmers, but by charging them. With that money, he was able to reinvest in public utilities and ensure that water and electricity in the countryside are actually reliable. So profit motives matter. The second thing that matters is explaining the business case to people, to farmers. We had the discussion last week with Swachh Bharat. Open defecation is a major problem in India. We basically have open defecation to the tune of 60% vis-a-vis some 4% in Bangladesh. And what the Prime Minister's initiative finds out is that it's not just taking some money, putting up a toilet somewhere and saying, okay, fine, I've done my duty. You actually need to work with the local population to explain the business case of using toilets. They're willing to invest. You need to explain to them why they should have toilets. And one of the main explanations is clearly the fact that we have to avoid diarrhea. In India, we have about 7,000 deaths due to diarrhea every week. That means one Nepal every week. The third thing, and just if you allow me, is, and we talked about this before, clusters. We need to drive innovation clusters in India, and that is happening, starting to happen. We have a lot of sort of incubation that's happening in the IT space. Some is happening in the hardware space. And I think the social space is also very nascent, but slowly moving in that direction.
Quite interesting, Wilfried. But then you actually pointed out the role of the corporations. Yes, without a doubt, we have enterprises like Nestle, Unilever, Vatsalya, and so on and so forth, who have really created an impact on the ground. But there is this 2% CSR law, The question is that 2% versus the 98%. How do you really look at this aspect in terms of India, and how do you really look at creating positive impact? How do you really push people to go for that 98%?
I think the 2% law is a well-intended law. What we see is for leading companies like Nestle and others, this is really not their main concern. They understand shared value. They know how to drive impact in those various countries. What we need to make sure is that we have a broader application of shared value concepts across various companies. That's where the 2% potentially can have an impact. Unfortunately, shared value initiatives or social ventures that make profit are not covered under the 2%. And that leads us back to CSR. And CSR, in my opinion, is inherently not scalable. So I think it's a good idea, but for many companies, I think this will just turn out to be another tax. So the application, the execution of that idea is something that we need to look at carefully and drive in a different direction.
Very interesting. And coming to the platform now, how do you think the platform that we are really pushing forward today and launching today, the Shared Value Initiative in India, could actually have a larger societal impact? How could it actually drive competitiveness of the nation at large?
I think it's important again to see that India has a Bollywood culture. I mean, for those who don't know Bollywood, it's much larger than Hollywood. And we have more, we have Tollywood, which is larger than Bollywood. Right? So I think what we like is basically we have these leading heroes, and what we need is an army. Right? So we have these great companies, Nestle and others, that are doing a fantastic job in driving shared value, having an impact in the country. But what we need is a standardization across companies. If you look at the housing sector, Tata Housing, Lodha, Shobha, all these have training schools for masons. But we don't have an India national sort of training degree for a mason. So we need to coordinate efforts. That's where a platform has a role to play. We need to leverage best practices from the leaders and make them applicable to companies that are laggards, that don't know what to do and how to drive change. We also need to actively move what is actually something that's very common in India. CSR is common. If you look at Tata, a lot of the brand name is linked to the fact that they're reinvesting a certain proportion of profits into the communities where they work. The same is true for a Kirloskar, for a Thermax, for a Forbes Marshall. There's lots of social work that's been going on typically around the sites of these organizations, but that's localized. So now how can we, again, create scalable models that have a nationwide impact? I think that's where a platform can make a significant difference.
Very interesting. And quick 30-second answer to when you talk about these two interesting things that we are talking about, shared value index and shared value enterprise certification. Well, what would you think about it? 30-second response, please.
No, again, you have two components. One is pull, one is push, right? The pull component basically needs to influence the minds of corporates and, even more importantly, the minds of customers and employees, right? So in India, that's typically a given. People want to create value for their country. They want to be part of India's story going forward. They want to help people that are in difficult straits. So sort of a certification and price can definitely create a positive momentum where basically you have to be certified to attract talent or be attractive for employees. The second thing in India is also basically the push component, the push component, meaning government needs to play a more active role in enforcing certain regulations. I think there's basically still a gray zone where you can pay to get out of certain obligations, and that needs to be addressed and needs to be fixed.
Thank you, Wilfried. Thanks a lot. So over to you, Justin, please.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for those contributions. So what we're going to do now is you've gotten these two great examples, one in Australia, one in India. And I think the thing that sort of jumps out at me thematically from both of these is you start to see different ingredients that are necessary, again, in different political and economic systems around the world, of what's going to really unlock greater progress on shared value. Now, what we want to do here now is take about 10 minutes and have a table conversation You will all, I heard somebody use this phrase once, you will all, since we have tables of 10 here, have to model brevity. But I want you to share the work that you're doing with the other folks at your table, and I want you to talk about and hone in on, with some of what you've heard here, enabling government policies, champions, leaders in the business community who are inspiring action, the different ingredients that you see in your work that are going to help accelerate and generate greater progress on shared value. And as you have those table conversations, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to submit in the appropriate place in the Pigeonhole technology some of those ideas. We will stay up here and we'll see those ideas on this screen down here, and I'll ask each of our four contributors here to have a quick couple of reactions and a debrief to the ideas you're coming up with, the key ingredients to accelerating shared value. So please take 10 minutes at your tables to discuss this idea. Thank you. Thank you for the rich conversations, which you can also carry on over lunch. We're going to go ahead and have our panel.
I'm going to do have social impact be mainstream.
We're going to go ahead and have our panel answer answer these questions.
Okay.
I'll take the overlap of sectors.
Can folks bring it back together, please? Thank you. Great, thank you. Can we bring it back together? Thank you. Great. So, Peter, let me start with you. We're still seeing the voting come in here. This probably feels a little bit like being in the UK last week. I don't know if the results here are as unexpected as they were there, but Peter, why don't you start and take on one of these questions that have been raised?
Okay. I've elected to take on the C-suite support and also how to have social impact be mainstream rather than in a silo, working backwards. And this actually is my kind of core motivation for being the chairman of the Shared Value Project in Australia. It's because I've worked in the philanthropic, in the CSR worlds as well. But for me, if you're actually going to change society, the core thesis here, which is how do you get businesses to be completely motivated, to be fully engaged. And I think that does come from the issue, in my mind, of getting, on the first hand, is to get C-suite support. But on the other hand is to get the enablers, both within a company and also within the not-for-profit sector. I think there's the concept of intrapreneurs that we have in corporations now, and I think that if we can find and foster those intrapreneurs, they will come out from within organisations as the catalyst for the ideas which give rise to shared value business ideas. And that's actually how you get businesses to move from sort of the concept of philanthropy and CSR being in a silo as being almost a cost bucket. I call it almost tithing in return for being able to go do business. So let's stop that dialogue. Let's find the entrepreneurs to find the shared value ideas within companies, and by liberating them, that's how I think you break down the silos. And I think that is also what's going to get C-suite support. I think the C-suite is challenged by the concept of societal engagement being delivered purely by corporate philanthropy or by CSR. They'd like to think that they're doing good business, that they're not tithing.
Great. Robert?
So I'm discussing the first one, the idea that we need to tie shared value to corporate strategy. But I think that, in fact, the corporate strategy has to be articulated as shared value. It's not enough to tie one to the other. It has to be it. It has to, the value statement, and corporations need clearly articulated statements of value. Why they're doing it, what they're and why customers and why employees ought to be motivated to do it. So in banking, if I say to people, what are we doing? Is this a transaction or is this a relationship? If it's a transaction, it may not be repeated. But if you judge what's being done on the basis of whether it's nurturing a relationship, and then a relationship has the possibility of delivering a lot of transactions, that's what will make a successful bank. But it'll only be a long, profitable relationship if everybody buys into it. So to me, the thing that's achieved the most votes is that it has to be tied to the corporate strategy, kind of undersells it, undersells how challenging this can be to corporations. It's not just adding something to something else, it's reimagining the purpose in the context.
Great, excellent, well put, Robert. Thank you. Wilfried?
Yeah, for me, it's basically the overlap of sectors and willingness to enter in unconventional partnerships. I think, again, the business of business is business. So basically, as long as you can create a value proposition, it is relatively easy to come up with partnerships. Going back to the HUL example, HUL has created a competitive advantage by having 170,000 villages and taluks as their distribution range. That is unique in India. That's something that has inherent value, and that is something that they can leverage, for example, by partnership with Tata Docomo, selling additional non-competing products in the same channel. So basically, again, shared value is something that is scalable, that enables partnerships, requires partnerships, because you need the Tata Docomo input also to make your own channel work. Right, so that's basically one thing. The second thing is that it's not limited only to companies. It can be done with NGOs as well, but that requires basically a combined understanding of assets and the value that you can generate and create together.
Great, thank you. Amit?
Okay, so I will talk about social measures and how it is interrelated to business metrics. So I think there's a great construct that was created by Professor Porter on social progress. So if we really understand this whole issue at the level of smaller levels of geography, that is at the provincial level and that is actually at the district level. So if I know what is the situation on ground, there can be actually businesses which can build metrics around it. Very clearly, say when you talk about say Nestle doing something in a place like Moga with 100,000 farmers actually getting affected by it. So there is a whole huge level of impact that actually happens on the ground from a societal perspective, and then of course it gets attached to the business metrics as well. On a societal level, what really happens is that you are reducing disparity. You are actually trying to affect malnutrition or the numbers that are actually happening there. You affect the child education and the things that is actually happening there. You create entrepreneurs. So what happens is there is an overarching thing that actually happens. So I see that there is a whole huge possibility of connecting the two constructs and letting enterprises really understand what's happening on ground and weave it into their corporate strategy.
Great, excellent, thank you. You know, just one last point I would add to these great comments, you know, in particular around the partnerships. Again, one thing that I see is the mindset shift that needs to happen within organizations. And I think one of the really interesting trends that you start to see, even in the acquisition and retention of talent within organizations, is companies now looking for people with a diverse set of backgrounds and experiences. So it may have been sufficient in the past to be able to run a business unit to read a P&L. But now what you increasingly see is companies looking for people with backgrounds that have worked in the nonprofit sector, who have worked in government, and who have worked in business, because they can bring a different perspective and a different understanding cross sectors that I think position them very well then to enter into unconventional partnerships and think differently about how to advance progress from personal lived experience. So we're now going to go to lunch, and before we do, can you please join me in a very warm thanks to our four panelists. We will reconvene at 1:15. Thank you so much.